This conference will now be recorded.
Yes. Well, thanks everybody, and just to underscore, as Nick mentioned, you've got audio rights here, unlike most webinars. So this is small invite format. So please feel free to chime in verbally. This is a conversation that's around the topic of acquisition and retention, so not new in that way, but it is hopefully going to get all of us thinking a bit broader, a bit differently about our audience, how we define them, how we think about marketing and building a relationship with them, and what is the potential if we do that rethink for acquisition and retention, those outcomes that we're chasing. So without further ado, everyone should be able to see my screen. I did confirm that with Nick. So if you can't see the screen now, just know that you should be able to see it, and you can speak up. We can try to troubleshoot. We're going to just cover things that are probably known and understood and more importantly felt by folks on the call, and that's the challenges with the current acquisition model and approach, and then start to introduce ideas that can have us give a rethink on this notion of acquisition, which is a reference to identity here. Identity is talking about how we can rethink the supporter, the supporters, who they are, what matters to them, what causes them to do. Value exchange, in this case, is a reference to how we can potentially match up offer and proposition to that identity and what that looks like beyond just the initial conversion. So without further ado, Nick, do you want to take us through this recap of current world?
I would love to. So, wanted to share with you one of my favorite marketing laws, in part because of its name and in part because of its truth. Andrew Chen has his law of shitty click-throughs, which is that overall time, all marketing strategies result in shitty click-through rates. And he's talking from a digital perspective, but this applies to any sort of medium. When mail was new coming to an area, you had scenes like The Music Man, where everyone is so happy to see the Wells Fargo wagon coming down the street. And that obviously isn't how we greet our mail anymore, with song and those sorts of things. Same thing with banner ads. The first banner ad had an 80% click-through rate. Now you need a microscope to be able to see it. And this is just a way of saying channels are new, and we get into then they get into the broader world and they become commonplace, and sometimes to the point of they become old, and we have an aversive reaction to them. And the challenge is that we're all fishing from the same pond. If you're in mail, you're doing exchange lists, you're doing co-ops likely, and you are over fishing from the same overfished pond as everyone else. As a result, we can see that the current model, our donors are reporting being overfished. The fish is talking back in this case. In research studies, people who get more solicitation requests say that they write down when they gave to a charity last. They have a list of what charities they give to. They try to find out when they last gave to a charity before they give again. They will say, I only give to charities of this type. They have a maybe pile. They have a box into which the mail goes. All of these are labeled defensive reactions to mail solicitation, and it's not unique to the mail sphere. You see the same sort of thing in email as well. Not surprisingly, the more donors get mailed, the more they agree with, I feel I must protect myself from the mail I get from charities. Protect yourself. And so this sort of cumulative exposure erodes donors' likelihood of donating, both to the charities that they currently give to and the charities that they could be giving to. And you see this in the research studies. There's experimental evidence that when you send out a new appeal, acquisition or donor, about 2/3 of the new revenues from that mail piece are cannibalized from the mail pieces that are around it, that larger part of the pie. The upper left, new revenues, that's what you actually get. And so We frequently use this study to talk about how the volume model of fundraising doesn't work, because you're most often robbing from the appeals you already have to get to the revenues that in theory are attributable to a piece. But what I want to talk about here today is this green sliver. That's 10% of a mail revenue. That 10% isn't cannibalized from the organization itself. It's cannibalized from other organizations to which that person gives. And so there's this unsweet spot where it's to the organization's benefit to mail a donor, but it's to all charitable organizations' benefit not to mail that donor. And whenever you have that type of disparity, when it's in the advantage of the individual to take one action and to the advantage of the group to take the exact opposite action, you have this tragedy of the commons. You have overfishing, you have overmailing, and you have co-ops that will say, oh, the more people donate, the more they're likely to donate to an organization. Well, that falls off at some point. And how do we know that? It isn't just theoretical. This is what we're seeing. New donors year over year. 2017, we had 19% fewer donors, new donors to organizations in 2017 than we did in 2016. Well, maybe that's just the election. Maybe that's people who had the Trump bump in 2016 who weren't able to replicate it in 2017. Well, we're seeing it this year as well. This is all from the Fundraising Effectiveness Project. And so the ways that we are going about acquiring donors are not working as well as they have been. And it's a slow decline, but that doesn't make the decline any less real. And so I wanted to pause here and see if this is a reality that y'all are facing as well, or if we're off base on this first part of the presentation. Thoughts? Stories, challenges, death threats? And if you do want to speak, then please remember to unmute your phone. Okay, hearing no speakers, then I'm going to assume that you're all either doing other things or that you agree with this. Silence is considered assent in this presentation. So moving forward with that, let's talk about what a new vision for acquisition can be. Not that this would replace what we're currently doing, which does bring in some new donors. But right now what we're trying to do is get people who donate to other organizations to care about our organization. We're going out to an outside list and seeing if we can get people who donate to organization A or donate to our organization. What if we flip that on its head? What if we said, let's take people who care about our organization, people who we can attract to our newsletter list, people who are advocates, people who come seeking information, people who come in because of an emergency, people who care about our organization, and let's try to convert them to donating. It's been an article of faith in fundraising lore that it's easier to get someone to donate to add another organization than it is to get a new person to donate. Well, because we're in this overfished world, maybe that isn't true anymore. And so what we're going to talk about for the rest of this is what that model looks like, how you can temper it with identity, because if we don't mention identity in a presentation, you have to put $1 in the donor voice swear jar. And really take that identity, use it to acquire new constituents and turn those constituents into donors for the short and long term.
Now, as Nick and I were putting this together, it raised for us the bazillion, which I think is an actual expression of currency. The bazillion-dollar question here is, all right, but care about what? So if we're going to focus on people who care, and then we're going to mine that universe, the understanding this care part and the what part is pretty darn critical. And it's to get that answer on what the care part is, you're not likely to find it in what is referred to as big data. And for charities, big data means the largest pile of data that you have, which if we're going to ignore kind of the unstructured part of your data that you probably haven't done much with. The structured big data that you have is transactional and behavioral, and there are lots and lots and lots of correlations there. Most of them are spurious, meaning they're bogus, even though they might look attractive on the surface. And to really get at this notion of care and understanding needs and the why behind behavior, we need to find small data. And one of the ways, one of the examples of small data is this notion of identity. But small data, in terms of the analysis and the types of data that you have, is all about causation and the why. This concept of identity is one that we have talked about a lot, because I would argue it's in some ways the most fundamental part of any attempt to market, fundraise, or communicate successfully. Identity is a social science term, and we all have lots of identities. You've got a gender identity, a political party or affiliation identity. You've got a professional identity. If you have kids, you have a parent identity. You may have a religious identity. Lots of different sort of subconscious and figurative hats that we wear. But we're not always wearing all of those hats. Those hats tend to be kind of context driven. And so I've only got on the parent hat when I'm doing parent stuff, and I've got the professional identity hat on when I'm doing professional stuff. And the reason the hat matters is that, as it turns out, identities tend to have values and goals attached to them, and they tend to be different. And when I've got an identity hat on, there are a certain set of values and goals that are activated, and those values and those goals are dictating my choices. They're dictating the words that I use, whether I turn left or turn right, who I vote for, who I don't vote for, whether or not I make a donation, right? So understanding what identity hat they have on is really important to understanding the why of their behavior. How important is this? There's a study that's worth checking out from the Wharton School of Business, but they did an experimental test study where they kind of artificially constrained the choices that people had available in thinking about donating. And so all the charities were from a similar subsector, let's say international relief, it doesn't matter. And then they provided effectiveness information. And they found out through the analysis that in that constrained hypothetical, people were making use of that effectiveness information. They were making use of the issue and the need case that the charity provided, right, and the overall efficacy. However, in the alternative condition, which I would argue is much closer to real world, where they had a diverse set of charity options in front of them from a host of different sectors, none of that information mattered. The issue, the need case, the efficacy, they were making choices based on what this study referred to as personal preference. What I would argue is identity. Needs-based kind of values and goals is what drives choices. Said differently, it is all about them. Has very little to do with you unless you can insert yourself into their world. As another sort of even more tangible, in this case, visual example of that, we were testing this to the extreme, and the title of the slide says it all. This is just underscoring how unimportant your particular issues are. And what trumps all of that is going to be who they are, identity. So this is a charity in the international relief space. It's got some it has a religious identity and culture to it, this particular charity. And this was an ad that was being run in a host of places where we, in reviewing the ad, would describe the part in green as issue or need, right? It's the beneficiary. In this case, it's Svetlana and feeding her life-saving gift. And then the part below was an attempt by the organization to reference the religious part of their orientation, and then, of course, to speak to people who shared that same religious view. So we did some Facebook ads, and so we took what has been an ad they've run in various mediums, created a Facebook version of it. This is what we call our control and what we labeled for our purposes as a hybrid, because it's got part identity and part sort of issue or beneficiary need. We were targeting this within the Facebook world to, as best we could, to match up with the type of people that tend to support this organization. And then we had two different test conditions. One that was 100% geared around the issue, the need, right? So we got rid of reference to the religious part of this and that identity piece. Then we ran a separate ad, another test condition, that was the opposite, all identity. Okay, this is all about dialing up and getting much more overt in how we dial that up, including using the labels themselves, evangelical Christian, and really playing out the identity part of all of this. Okay, now this is an extreme to make the point. You wouldn't necessarily execute on this in this way for a variety of reasons, but the point is we wanted to draw some really stark contrast and see what the outcome was. And here we're seeing that initial click-through rate, control and versus issue only. You actually get increased lift with just the issue only. But the interesting part is we get even more lift, and in fact, over the control, 53% increase in click-through when we focus entirely on who they are and what motivates their decision-making, okay? In this case, we're marketing to a bunch of new folks. You see reference to the organization here. A, that's really small. B, unless they have a clue what this brand is, they're not making any decisions based on the organization. It's 100% based on who they are and what motivates them to make choices. Now, part of what we're attempting to kind of convey and get across and get reaction and feedback from you all on is this is not a web session where we're saying, well, you should abandon direct mail and go to Facebook, because direct mail in this case is the pond and it's grossly overfished, and Facebook has a bazillion people, and so that's an ocean in relative terms, and so just go to the ocean because there's more people there and it's less overfished than the pond, and you'll be in good shape. What you saw on the prior slide is an argument for not just rethinking the places that we look for folks, the body of water in this case, but also the bait, right? What is it that we're using to try to create and establish some sort of initial connection with an audience of people in a given channel?
Before I launch into this, any questions or comments on what you've seen so far? Okay, so
tons of agreement and just violent agreement and acquiescence, Nick. Clearly, they wouldn't possibly be multitasking.
Yep. So we will plow ahead. What we're seeing here is the Norwegian Cancer Society took a look at 79 different tasks that people perform on their website and things that they look for, and asked their users what they see. So the top 6 things represented 25% of the votes, and they're all related to someone who has an identity of relationship to cancer. Either they have cancer themselves or they care about someone with cancer. Fairly clear on what that website to do. On the bottom end of the list, donate, volunteer, memorial, legacy gift, those things that we want people to do are bringing up the rear. And so we focus on trying to get those people to convert. How do we make the donation form more efficient? How do we get more volunteers? How do we light boxes? How do we get emails? Or all of those sorts of things. Try to get that small portion of people to get more engaged and donate and sign on the line that is dotted. So with that in mind, that is the pond in this case. This is a smaller group of people. Not to say that you shouldn't focus on those people. They are highly motivated and you want to get them to give. But above the line, that's the ocean. That is a group of people with an identity that you want to serve, that you are able to provide information to. And by giving information, by giving something to that audience, you may be able to get something from them thereafter. So the reason that we have Norwegian Cancer Society, which sounds a bit random here, as an example here, is they took that and they put that into practice. They removed calls to action from a lot of different places on their website and focused on creating content. So this is an example of, and it's originally in Norwegian, so the translation may or may not be super great, but an example of nanotechnology and how microbubbles can help with cancer treatment. And so a page like this, that's very focused on meeting the needs of the person coming to the site and the identity of the person who would become a donor to them in the long term, ends like this: support vital cancer research with a monthly donation or a one-time donation. And this isn't unique to this particular charity. There have been tests here in the United States that having this sort of call to action after content can increase donations 800% from that particular page. But looking at the Norwegian Cancer Society example, the results that came from that were let's call it 200, I think it's fair to round up here, 200% increase in one-time donations, an almost 300% increase in recurring donations, and an over doubling of their membership. And it was because they were giving something of value to the person first and then asking for a donation that linked directly to that value that was created. And I'll give an example from my own work. One of the best donation asks I ever did when I was at Mothers Against Drunk Driving that wasn't a matching gift or an end-of-year gift, so normal everyday appeal. One of the best ones wasn't a donation ask. It was an advocacy appeal for one of our banner issues. A lot of people took the action, and then after they took the action, and only after they took the action, did we ask them for a donation. And that donation was specific to our advocacy efforts. And that had results that were unlike any single ask that we had that wasn't tied to a so-called giving time of year. Now, here's the trick. That reciprocity has a shelf life. So a study took a look at people who were leaving a hospital and how they were asked for money. And this was a male example, so this works in all channels. And they had been batching their donation asks to run every 2 to 4 months. So there was this great natural experiment. They got to see the response rate to the same appeal from the same type of person, but with a different amount of time after they left the hospital, whether after their first visit or after their last visit. And it turns out that delaying by 30 days or moving up by 30 days had the same impact as offering a matching gift would. So instead of a matching gift, instead of a technique that I think most of us use or at least have seen used to profitable end in nonprofits, you can have that same impact by asking people immediately after they have done something that gave reciprocity, that demands reciprocity. And I'll give an example. Both of my kids are on the autism spectrum. What I found when we were first figuring out what my oldest, my daughter, was going through, we went to Autism Speaks. And we got information from them. They have a first 100-day kit. Here's what to find out about. Here's how to talk to your doctor. Here's what to do for schooling. All of the things that we didn't know when we were in the void and not knowing what we were facing. That was a balm for us in that moment. It filled an emotional need that we have. Now, there are all sorts of informational and emotional needs that can, going back to that story, we were a monthly donor at that moment and have been for the decades since. That type of reciprocity isn't just filling information. It can be filling an emotional need. I heard about this political issue. I want to take action. This organization allows me to take action. My need is met. I want to do something more. Here's a donation. Or this organization has done me a service by allowing me to take action. Here's a donation. And when those things, like the Svetlana example, are tied directly to the identity of the person coming in, you have an even better chance of getting to them.
Yeah, just I'm going to highlight a couple points, and to go back to and probably overburden the fishing metaphor. I mean, this is within the website, as Nick mentioned. The donate forms are the ponds, right? And yes, we could spend a lot of time trying to optimize the form that has some value, but there's a tiny number of people who ever make it there. If we're thinking about the ocean of the website, where the vast majority of visitors are coming to other parts of the site, starting with the home page.
Kevin?
Yeah, I had lost audio there.
Okay, so did I. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Nick.
Okay, then let's go to our break glass in case of emergency method here. I am going to try to take over the presenting, and hopefully we will get Kevin back in just a second. So let me see. Okay, are you seeing where to start? Digging deeper cartoon?
Yep.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Sorry about the technical difficulties there. So what we're going to try to do is figure out what that broadest audience is with a discrete identity. Not saying, hey, let's advertise to all of Facebook, but finding the particular niches of Facebook that, or Google ads, or mail audiences, or whatever channel we choose to use. It's about finding that audience, and it's really flipping our view of audiences on its head. Instead of saying, here are our male donors, out of those male donors, we're going to look at parents. We're going to start with, here are our parents. How do we communicate with them and create messaging for them across platforms that makes the most sense? So that identity is key here. And we've talked about some of these already: direct connection to disease. Parents are an important one, especially for example, child sponsorship organizations. There's even a subset of parents with those organizations that say, I am sponsoring a child so that my child gets to see an area of the world outside of their own sphere. Obviously, that person's reason for giving is so much different from someone who either is a parent but giving for different reasons, or isn't a parent and is sponsoring a child as a bit of a substitute for that. For the parent who's trying to educate your child, you send them facts about the country, you send them coloring books, maps, all of those sorts of things. For the person who's doing it as a proxy child, then you can be sending them letters from that child and pictures and updating them on their impact, making them feel that emotional thing. Those are different audiences and should be communicated with differently. So once you have those sorts of things, what can we offer them that's of value? So that's a brainstorming process, and we'll talk a little bit about an example of those in a second. And then researching to validate to make sure that what we are, that our audiences are legitimate and they actually want the things that we think they want. So I'll pause here. Anyone want to talk through a specific audience that they know they have or think they have? Okay, then we will go with the default. Kevin, are you back?
I think I am. I was talking to myself for quite a while, I guess.
Okay. So we're back to where to start and going into the American diabetes example.
Okay.
Can you see my screen?
Can I? Yes.
Okay. Do you want to take it from here?
Sure. So we had done some of that initial insights and digging work, and for disease charity, I grant it's easier. All this same sort of digging applies, even if your beneficiaries aren't also potentially your donors. So in international relief, all of this work can and should be done. Diabetes, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that the way to define your audience are the people who are have various connections to the disease. You've got type 1 versus type 2, which is a pretty clear line of demarcation, and our insights work kind of validated they've got fundamentally different needs, and then you can subdivide from there. In the case of type 2, that's a very large population that's already been diagnosed with type 2, but one of their points of emphasis are these people who are at risk. And so we were thinking about the population that's at risk and said, all right, what is it that we can offer up? And it doesn't take long to sort of inventory the assets that this organization has available to see that we don't have to create anything. There's an enormous amount of content. In fact, the bulk of the organization is geared towards serving and meeting the needs of the audience when defined this way. So they have a great, as do a lot of organizations, screening quiz just as a way to start the conversation and give you some preliminary information and guidance. And so this is us aiming an ad, and we could do some selection on some demographic parameters that would get us a little bit more likely to get to a higher incidence of people who were at risk and it was sort of on their brain. And then you can see that our proposition here is not donating at all. It's about trying to reach these people and understand where they are in kind of their daily lives. They are not looking around to see if they can make a donation to American Diabetes or sign a petition, but they may, if they're in the cohort that we're aiming for, have lingering concerns about whether they might be at risk, and that's who this is speaking to. And this is the metrics around this activity. So we have a couple stats, one of which was provided from this activity, the Facebook ad cost per visitor. That's based on our direct testing and metrics. And then using the M&R benchmarking report to get at value per website visitor. That's something that can actually be determined. There's a monetary value there if you look at the conversion rates and number of leads. We're getting to a net positive on acquisition of 49 cents. Means that's what our expected outcome when we get a large number of people through the top of the funnel by starting where they are, delivering value, and then, yes, getting them to donate.
And to extend off of that, that value per website visitor varies drastically based on identity as well. For American Diabetes Association, as for all of your organizations, there's a greater value in getting someone to come to the site who wants to take their diabetes screening or who wants to get resources to deal with type 1 for their child than someone who's doing a book report on diabetes and has to find information about it. And
as Nick had mentioned in his sharing his personal story with autism, this is just like this is not a webinar to pitch, go market your same stuff in Facebook because it's an ocean versus the pond. This is not an argument for just try and improve your initial conversion and be done with it. This is trying to imbue this concept of understanding who they are, what their needs are, and recognizing that delivering on those needs is the absolute best way to get to a larger group of people, a group of people who are not in some of the current sort of solicitation channels. And it is the best way to establish that connection with one person and with a million of those people, and that becomes the mantra, the recurring mindset and approach is this notion of reciprocity. We need to continue to deliver value to get value. There's lots of different ways that can be packaged up. The notion of membership needs, in our view, to be completely rethought. The vast majority of memberships across different kind of subcategories in the charity space are frankly, just a bit of a ruse. I mean, it's a term, it's a label. We slap it on there because it did better than calling them a donor. And all of those offers in certain subsectors look identical. Environmental space, for example, every single membership offer is the exact same. You get a bag, a tote, whatever the heck it is, some low price point, and the benefits are thin at best. But there is opportunity to, and there are some instances where this has been done, where they start to think about your audience in the broadest terms, understand needs, validate those, do some test and learn, where you can start to bundle up a really meaningful set of content and or assets that people are willing to pay for. We are not in the business of getting donations. We are in the business of raising funds. That's something I would underscore. This is just a screenshot, an illustration of the point that we're not just trying to focus on initial conversion and then they get dumped into whatever the normal stream is. This is looking at the first month, and of course you've got another 11 after that to get to the full year. But the way that we need to start thinking about segmentation and journey is tied to who they are, these identities. In this case, we've got type 1 and type 2. And of course, over time, to Nick's point, that all click-through rates get shitty after a while. All conversion and journey start to plateau after a while. But the opportunity here is that if you're just slicing, in this case, in a fairly simple way, but it's certainly more involved than one size fits all, you've got opportunity and a really long runway to continue to further segment within, in this case, the type 2 population and all the myriad of ways that you can think of along with type 1. So this is not a initial conversion to dump them in the stream. It's not thinking through the first month of journey and having it be segmented and calling it a day. It is a mindset and a set of processes and practice that get us to sustainable growth. And again, this is not a just believe exercise. There's a big false choice out there that we've got to sacrifice the short term if we're going to do this relationship thing. It's nonsense. Yes, it is almost kind of sort of finally over. The part of what we've been recommending here and hoping to get your thoughts on is the very unsexy notion of data type. So in kind of data spheres, there's reference to first-party data and second-party data and third-party data. Well, first-party data, there's lots of examples of it, not least of which, and first-party data is, what data do you have directly from your supporters? And of course, you've got lots of transactional data. That is first-party data. You understand that. You're making use of that. That's in your garden, not someone else's. At the other extreme, there's the third-party data. That's the stuff that you pay for, that's in the public domain. There is nothing remotely proprietary about it. It tends to be lots of correlation, very little causation, and it's not worth very much for the very reason that it's not remotely proprietary. What could you possibly come up with as a differentiated proposition that someone else can just go buy off the shelf just like you? So when we're talking about this notion of identity, it requires collecting that data. That can be done at scale if it's assigned the importance that it needs to be assigned. If it's treated as a census, not a survey, you actually bake it into process. So if you're doing, there's a whole host of acquisition channels where you can just bake this identity capture into the process. And of course, if you're doing digital advertising, there's a lot of self-selection that's going to occur on the front end with the way that the ad is messaged and in some cases targeted. And we've already hit on the reciprocity piece. And last but not least, it's this idea that personalizing and tying to their values and needs is an every time thing, not a sometime thing. And we got to think, of course, way beyond just using their first name and some other really superficial definitions of customization or personalization.
Yeah, on that note, I know you guys have talked about in previous times, and sorry, this is Brenna for folks that don't know my voice. You guys have talked about using like employment identity and kind of these other monikers versus or in addition to like first name and that first person identity stuff. And I think about like what helps them versus creepy. Like where does that line cross? Have you done testing around that?
Well, in all the cases that we're talking about, Brenda, on that, we're getting that information straight from them, right? So we're not doing third-party data append to get to occupation in that example that you cited. And so if I'm going to refer to a let's say occupation matters, maybe you're the ACLU and you found that lawyers are a group that is kind of disproportionately interested in your cause, and so in referring to them as lawyers, I don't want to rely on some third-party list, first of all, because there's, in addition to it not being proprietary, it's notoriously unreliable data, notoriously unreliable. And so we would always be advocating for first-party data capture, meaning I want to get self-explicated data. I want it straight from the horse's mouth. So even in the case of those type 1, type 2 examples where we're bringing in people who are clicking on an ad that's all about type 2 risk assessment, right? I still want to have questions that are aimed at finding out straight from them sort of how they categorize themselves, and the same thing would apply to profession. And so if we're just re-referencing information they've shared, it's I think likely to fall outside of the creepy category.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. So it's just leveraging more of that, like again, you're like consensus or census rather, like and surveys, so that we are getting more of that data directly from the individual target.
Right. And again, we think the nomenclature you want inside the organization is think about census, not survey, right? Surveys suggest that we're only going to get it for a certain percentage. And while that's certainly going to be true overall in aggregate, especially for the existing house file, for newly acquired folks, you can actually bake that into the acquisition process in a lot of different instances so that you get it for everybody. And even though it's in some cases going to be a survey that you send out, say, to the existing house file, and of course not everyone's going to respond to that, you are getting a sample. The idea is you're working towards census, and it doesn't take long before you've got some critical mass there to begin to target and build out journeys tied to that newly captured first-party identity data.
Couple of things to extend on that. There was a great quote from the book Factfulness, and it's this Nobel Prize winning researcher, and he's talking about how people do survey data, and talking to economists, they'll say, well, we ask people every sort of question about their income and the way they live, but we would never ask about sex. That's far too personal. And then they asked sex researchers, what do you ask about? And they ask, well, we ask everything that has to do with sex, but we never ask these people income. It's just too personal. And so it's all about making sure that there's a context to that ask and making sure that that ties back to something that is of value to the organization. The other thing, and I was able to pull it up over to the side here, is there was a report in July from Deloitte called Predictably Inaccurate, and unfortunately I don't have a slide for it, but looking at third-party data, 84% of data broker data people said was 0 to 50% correct about their economic data. 75% said vehicle data was less than 50% correct, and 59% said easily available demographic data was incorrect in those third-party data, which is another reason that we're skeptical of those types of appends. Other questions, comments, thoughts?
So you're saying we should get sex researchers and economic well-being researchers in the same room and just have them, that'd be an interesting conversation, it sounds like.
Yes, not my main point, but certainly a point you can draw from that.
Sex, money, get some political researchers in there. Then we can talk about sex, money, and politics, the three taboos.
Yeah.
I think there's one more slide on there, Nick, that we can leave as a parting shot. And, this is because we hopefully have delivered some value here by trying to understand where you all are as an audience. We feel it's appropriate to offer up a bit of an ask, albeit a soft one, where you're just seeing off to the right. There's some opportunity here to pilot and test some of this, and we'd welcome the opportunity to work with some of you on that. But also wanted to make sure we addressed any other questions or comments or commentary for that matter. All right. Well, Nick, I guess we can give people their 11 minutes of life back.
Yep. Thank you all for your time today. Hope this was valuable for you. Feel free to shoot us any questions that you have afterwards. We will be sending out slides. We'll be sending out the recording. And hopefully it's something that you'll mull over and have some questions like what identities might work for my organization or what sort of things that you would recommend that we can get into brass tacks on. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah.